Who really killed Goliath, that famous story from the Old Testament? And what else have we missed if there's a different version? Everyone knows the story. The young shepherd boy, David, a sling, a stone, and a giant warrior named Goliath. It's one of the most famous tales in history. But what if I told you there's another version of this story found in the very same Old Testament in a different book? In the Book of Chronicles, we find a curious discrepancy, one that credits a man named Elhannan the Bethlehemite, not David, but a mighty warrior of David's, who actually struck down the Philistine giant named Goliath. So which account is true? Is this a simple scribal error, a theological rewrite, an apologetic? Or is there more to the story? This is the kind of deep dive storytelling you can expect from the EpicLife Podcast, while my official launch is still a few weeks out due to the throat stuff. I'm going to give you something to chew on in the meantime. Today, I'm releasing a special archived segment that was originally recorded for Intrepid Radio on June 19th of 2019, where I break down the David and Goliath controversy carefully, thoughtfully, and with an historian's eye. History, legend, faith, and reason all collide here. Epic Life is coming. Get ready. Now here's that clip. As we try to get beneath the biblical story, to find the underpinnings to all of this, at every stage we find a narrative about David that's been constructed with the goal of glorifying David, not with the aim of presenting a historical account of what really happened. And that's the key to apologetic. The whole key to seeing the apologetic construct of the story of David in Scripture. You're trying to get at the historical count, which eludes us. At the same time, every stage of David's story, we find something that's been written to glorify David, to make him look good. And I'm talking in the way the priests and the scribes wanted it to look. For the people of Israel. They were trying to make David look better than the guy he probably really was. And they're trying to attribute things and acts of God when there was no way to know that in an historical narrative. If you take out what I've said are the two big things about David that people know, he wrote the Book of Psalms and he killed Goliath. That would be only a fraction of those who all they know about David is, oh, David and Goliath, right. And when we turn to the story of David fighting Goliath, we confront a different sort of problem altogether. It's not that the biblical story itself is in any way empirically unbelievable. This is not an unbelievable story. Unless, of course, you take the word giant to mean mythically giant. Admittedly, the height that was given for Goliath, 6 cubits in a span, which we've talked about both nights now, before this night, works out to fairly incredible 9.5 feet. That means he was a tall guy. You know, there's that Chinese basketball player who's 9'2". So it's not that it's an impossible height for a human to gain and still be athletic. Though the Septuagint says 4 cubits rather than 6 at certain places. This Old Testament is off of the Septuagint. It says 6 cubits in a span was Goliath's height. 4 cubits in a span wouldn't have been out of the question for somebody in that period of time as being considered a giant guy. It's suggesting that, by the way, that would be around 6.5 feet, that the Hebrew version has been altered to make the giant even more mythically imposing. But there's nothing impossible about David facing and defeating Goliath the way the text says. Remarkable, even unlikely perhaps, but not impossible. And to say that a scribe may have changed that to make the story more plausible, there's no proof for that either. That's a speculation all in and of itself. What makes the biblical story of David and his defeat of Goliath impossible to accept as historical fact is this. Now, Folks, maybe you didn't know this. If you're Judeo-Christian, if you grew up in the church and you heard stories of David and Goliath, maybe you didn't know this. I know the first time I learned this, I went, what? For all the years I've studied the Bible, I've never seen this before? Was it because I was willfully blind and didn't want to see it? Or just read right over, or was never taught this? It's not that the story isn't historically plausible, but it's the historical fact that elsewhere in the same Old Testament scriptures, the Bible talks about an entirely different person is said to be the guy who killed Goliath, not David. I said, what? The first time I heard that, I said, give me that Bible, let me look that up. In 21:19 of 2 Samuel, it says this, and there was again a battle at Gob with the Philistines, where Elhannan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, a Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was a battle in Gath, where a man of great stature that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he was also born to the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimea, the brother of David, slew him. All right. Now, what I want you to see in here is that text is a bit altered. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. Just read that passage, and this can hardly be a different Goliath. It talks about Goliath of Gath. But here it said his brother. Both are Philistines. Both are from the Philistine city of Gath. And most remarkably, both have the same impressive spear. The words, the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's bar, are found in verbatim in both 2 Samuel 21:19 and 1 Samuel 17:7. How is it possible that 2 different people could have slain the same giant at 2 different times in 2 different places? And this isn't a problem of modern readership, as if we're simply too far removed from the conventions of ancient literature to understand these texts. The ancient author of Chronicles saw precisely this same problem. His rendering of the note about Elhannan reveals a transparent, even desperate, attempt to overcome it. In 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5, we learn that Elhannan, the son of Jair, killed Lachmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's bar. Now Elhannan has been stripped of his victory over Goliath, which is replaced by a victory over, of all people, Goliath's brother. The description of the giant's spear remains the same. The earliest readers of Samuel's biblical authors themselves grappled with the fact that 2 different people are said to have killed the same Philistine. If I look at 21:19 again, the son he slew, and it's added here. The reason I want to repeat this, even in the English Bible, what they would do is they would add italicized words for words that have been added for clarity. So the verse actually reads, and there was again a battle in Gob with the Philistines, where Elhannan, the son of a Bethlehemite, slew Goliath the Gittite, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, when it says David was facing Goliath, the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, it says of Goliath. In this, they added in italics, the brother of is inserted before the name Goliath, which means that did not exist in the original text of this book that they translated from. So what we have here is a verse that says, Elhannan slew Goliath the Gittite, whose spear staff was like a weaver's beam. When back in 1 Samuel it talks about David, and Goliath came out and he had a spear whose shaft was like a weaver's beam. And it says that David slew him, but now here it says that Elhannan slayed him, but an editor put in the brother of before the name Goliath. So it sounds a little bit like political propaganda. Yes, you're absolutely right, Wolf. That's exactly what it sounds like. So either David killed him twice, once with a sling and once with a sword, except David is not Elhannan. What you've got is a giant being killed at two different times and places by two different guys. Surely one of these accounts is a duplicate of the other. The question then becomes, which story is the original and which is the duplicate? It hardly seems likely that anyone who would think to take a story and take a very full narrative of David's victory and reduce it to that single verse. There's this story about David and retelling it with a different protagonist is kind of silly. David was the well-known person. You would think that some guy, not David, that was my neighbor, Elhannan, who did that. That it just seems so unlikely. So this notice about Elhannan's defeat of Goliath is very similar to the other such brief notices about the valor of David's warriors. It's stuck unremarkably in the midst of one such little collection. In 2 Samuel 22, 15 through 22, we hear about the exploits of some of David's men as they fought this series of Philistine giants. Abishai, the son of Zuriah, Sibbecai, the Hushathite, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, are all said to have won battles of single combat against Philistines who had huge weapons, a heavy spear, a new suit of armor, or physical abnormalities, 12 fingers and 12 toes. And the story of Elhannan defeating Goliath is simply part of this list. That is, it's an organic part of a list of deeds of David's men and people who fought for David. It's an organic list. The material in which it's found is organic, and it's not given any special prominence there. Other stories about David's warriors are preserved in the biblical text as well. Adino, the Eznite, who killed 800 men single-handedly in 2 Samuel 23. Eleazar, the son of Dodo, who alone fought off an entire Philistine army. Shammah, the son of Agag, who did the same thing. Abishai, the son of Zuriah, who defeated 300 men by himself. And Benaniah, the son of Joadiah, who killed a lion just as David claims to have done in the Goliath story. And a giant Egyptian as well, to boot. Now, these brief accounts are obviously legendary deeds of David's Knights of the Round Table, so to speak. They're the things that they did, the mythical triumphs that attach themselves to all these heroes, these men of renown surrounding David. And they're the sorts of story that we find in Homer about the heroes of the Trojan War. Although clearly invented, these warrior legends have their own internal logic. They explain why David and his handpicked soldiers were chosen, and why their names are worthy of preservation for posterity. Elhannan has no reason to exist in the Bible except as a result of his heroic defeat of the Philistine giant Goliath, unless you add in the words, which are not found in the text originally, the brother of. And so it's increasingly difficult to believe that he would have been invented merely for the purpose of giving him glory that was rightfully and originally due to David, the ultimate biblical hero. So why does his account exist there? And remember, language means something. When I say that in the English Bible it says the brother of, those words did not exist in the text from which the English was translated. It did not exist in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew. They did not exist there, those words. It says Elhannan killed Goliath, the Gittite of Gath, is what that means, Gittite, whose spear was like a weaver's shaft. So that appears twice in the text, with two different guys killing him. However, it's plausible that David's legend could have been embellished by appropriating the glory of relative nobody. So if David grabbed the story of Elhannan and used it as his own, or if it was attributed to David by somebody else, that would do a lot in glorifying David. But the other way around, Elhannan grabbing David's story, people would say, you're a liar. You didn't do that, David did that. So the sort of transferal from the unknown to the known is a well-attested feature of heroic tales. This happens all the time in history, folks. And the legends of Robin Hood are borrowed from a really wide range of real life, but otherwise virtually unknown outlaws. I just did some recent study on Robin Hood. It's interesting that a lot of his deeds, and you may have heard this before, perhaps borrowed from other people who took on the mantle of Robin Hood. This is exactly what they're saying about these texts here right now. The legends of Robin Hood were borrowed from a wide range of these real-life criminals, crooks, outlaws. And in some traditions about King Arthur have their basis in actual events. But these events about Arthur have been linked only to a mythical king. So stories accrete to famous figures, just as quotations accrete to famous speakers. Proverbs to Confucius. Now, sometimes we say the Bible says this and this and this, and it doesn't really. Or folksy humor to Mark Twain. And we find out he didn't say that thing at all. When one wants to say more about a character than one knows to be true, there's this infinite amount of material to choose from. And a story can be invented out of whole cloth, or it can be borrowed from the life of someone otherwise unknown. In fact, it really seems that in the pages of the text that the story of David and Goliath was borrowed not only from the exploits of Elhannan, but also from those of Elhannan's brother, Eleazar, who is also, naturally enough, both of them from Bethlehem. Also one of David's warriors, also unmentioned anywhere else in the narrative. While Elhannan's story specifically mentions the figure of Goliath, he of the mighty spear, looks like a weaver's shaft, Eleazar's story is the origin for the narrative framework of the battle. The Philistines challenge the Israelites to fight, and all the Israelites but Eleazar fall back. And they're afraid while Eleazar wins this great victory. And not only is it the same situation we found in the David story, but the location of the battle is even the same. Epis Damim, the Valley of Elah, are the two stories paralleling the David narrative. And it becomes even more unlikely that the David story is the original story of David and Goliath. We'd have to believe that someone took the glory away from David, split it in two, and gave it to relative nobodies. It's far easier to see that David is the borrower. And who better to borrow from than two soldiers from Bethlehem, David's own hometown, probably guys he grew up with. Minor legends about minor characters have been taken up and dramatically expanded, and complete with this whole mythical descriptions of Goliath's size, grand declarations of faith by the young David. And so somewhat ironically, these legends are explaining why Elhannan and Eleazar deserve to be part of David's military retinue, and are reused to explain how David acquired his position in Saul's army. As we've seen, this greatly expanded narrative of the Goliath story serves its purpose well, presenting us with a David who is faithful, he's fearless, he's unique among his peers, and eminently worthy of the kingship that will soon be his. And the original legends of Elhannan and Eleazar were but two among many such tales. The embellished story makes David out to be this man like no other. He acquired their stories. At its heart, however, is not truly David's story. It's not. And the Goliath of 1 Samuel 17 is a second-hand creation, and the entire narrative is a literary exercise in Davidic glorification and scribal apologetics. Now, I want you to hear something, because I think it's just beautiful when you read the first story. David in front of Goliath. And this is what was so impressive about the actual story when we're told that it's David who did this. Now, in 1 Samuel 17, now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shoco, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shoco and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah. And the Philistines stood on one mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And if he's able to fight with me, and to kill me, and then I will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants, and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Now when Saul the king and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, David, cue in the country music. Now, David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and the next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And then the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself for 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, blah, 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 and he brings food to the camp. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hands of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brothers. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spoke according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sorely afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and will make his father's house free in Israel. That's tax-free, by the way. And David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that kills this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So it shall be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spoke unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I done? What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward the other, and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again, in the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spoke, They rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him, Goliath. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he's a man of war from his youth." And David said unto Saul, "Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him." This is David's story to the king. I grabbed the lion by his beard, kicked the shit out of him, and killed him. The servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Now, listen between the lines here, folks. This is a story that's being recited about David in the book of Samuel. All right? Listen to the tone of this story and how David talks in it. He's pissed off at the Philistine because he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said unto David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." You know, here's Saul the king, who stands head and shoulders already over all the rest of the men. He's not out there fighting this guy. He says to David, "Go, by all means, go, take him. Sick him, David." And Saul armed David with his own armor, and he put an helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with the coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor. And David said unto Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them." And David put them off of him. Now, in other words, Saul took his armor, his own armor, and put him on David. Too big for David. David said, "I haven't tested these things out. I haven't proven them. It's too big for me. I can't use it." Blah, blah, blah. He takes them off. Did Saul have any intent there, by the way, to let the people think it was him going out to battle in his armor? David took his staff in his hand, and he chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David. Here's these 2 guys out in the battlefield now, David and the giant. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. Now keep in mind the apologetic of this story. He disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, "Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, listen to David's speech here, on the battlefield, facing possible death. He's pretty confident, though. "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." That's quite a speech to deliver when you're out facing somebody hand-to-hand combat. Consider that as we go on. "And it came to pass when the Philistine arose, and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted, ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted, and pursued the Philistines, until thou come to the valley to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way, to Sharaim, even unto Gath, and unto Ekron. As David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him, and brought him before Saul, with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. And it goes on from there. Okay, so now that's the biblical story that we read about David. And if you listen closely, you can hear the apologetic in that story. You can hear the glorifying of David, of making him something, the heroic mythical deeds of David. I believe this story, however, as we find about David, that we've got somebody else killing him in a different book. And it's one of the unmentioned people, the unknowns, who they're in a list says that he killed Goliath, but that story had been taken and brought over to David. At its heart, it's not truly David's story. It's a second-hand creation. The entire narrative is this literary exercise in Davidic glorification. When we first encounter David, we find this young man who's destined to be the king. He's anointed by God's true prophet. The antithesis of all that is wrong with Saul is what David brings to the table. He's not only destined, but more importantly, he's more worthy. He's gripped by the Spirit of Yahweh, a musician who will one day give this lyrical voice to the faith of his people, a warrior for God among timid men. The most famous images of David, the most important ideals associated with him are laid out right at the start of his story before you know anything else about him. And this is precisely what the biblical authors intended. Everything that David does from this point forward, and everything that we think about him, is colored by these first two stories and the theological weight that they bear. That he's the sweet psalmist of Israel, a musician, and that he is the slayer of the giant. And as we've seen, however, these stories of David's youth have no basis in reality. David's origins, his hometown, his father's name, and the fact that he entered Saul's military service, everything else is invented for the purpose of glorifying David, of building up who David is, making him someone special, even in advance of his kingship. The David of popular imagination, this insightful author of the Psalms, the valiant warrior for God, all these two characteristics about him is a construct of the biblical authors and the traditions that subsequently grew about this greatest of all Israelites. David didn't write the Psalms. He didn't. I almost want to put in there, he might have written a couple of them, but most of them are attributed to him. David didn't kill Goliath. The defining features of David in the modern imagination are merely that. They're imaginary. They are what the biblical authors, and we too, want David to be, not what he really was. These then are the questions we have to reckon with. If David didn't do what we imagined him to have done, what did he really do? And if David was not who we think he really was, then who was he really? So these are the things that I want you to consider when thinking about this story of David. How have we proven that David wasn't the slayer of Goliath? It was simply because the slayer of Goliath is mentioned in a list of heroes of David's, his men. And the same character is killed by a different guy, but it's extrapolated and used for David. The same thing with the Psalms. the Hebrew language and the subscriptions. All of these things start to point toward David not being the sweet psalmist of Israel, although he could probably sing, he could probably play the lyre, he probably had some musical qualities. I know lots of guys that aren't musicians, that aren't kings, who know how to play guitar and can sing a good tune. David obviously did not kill Goliath. I even have a rough time even saying that now, because I was so used to this being who this man was, that it's hard to grasp that when you look at the historical facts. It's hard to grasp that what these biblical authors were doing was creating a narrative about a man that they needed to glorify in the eyes of Israel and for the history of Israel.